All right, so listen to this. You guys sent in a request to deep dive into how India's new budget, the 2025-26 budget, might end up impacting things over in Nepal. And we're talking like economic forecasts. So it's going to do to trade even a little bit about cryptocurrency. And all this is coming from some expert commentary and analysis that was originally published in Nepali.
Yeah, and one of the really interesting things that jumps out from these sources is that India really seems to be kind of turning inwards, focusing on how to boost their domestic production, becoming more self-reliant.
So India wants to be more self-sufficient.
Right, and it's not just like a slogan or anything, it's a real strategy. They've got to become less reliant on global supply chains and try to become like a major manufacturing force on their own.
Yeah, that makes sense for them, but I'm already starting to think about how that shift, like moving more inwards, could have some ripple effects, across the border into Nepal.
And the source material actually goes into that quite a bit, especially when you start talking about trade.
Right, because
Nepal is really dependent on India for a huge amount of its imports. I mean, we're talking like 2/3.
whoa.
So any kind of policy changes that happen over in India, they have a direct impact on what's available, on the shelves in Nepal, and of course, how much all that stuff costs.
Okay, so this isn't just like some, theoretical econ stuff. We're talking about the prices of groceries, electronics, all the everyday things that people in Nepal need.
Yeah, exactly. It has a real impact. And there are a couple of specific examples in this budget that really highlight that dynamic.
Okay, like what?
Well, for one thing, the source mentions that India has significantly reduced tariffs on things like mobile phone parts and chargers.
Okay.
Which could mean that, consumers in Nepal end up with cheaper electronics.
Which on the surface sounds like a good thing, right?
At first glance, it sounds great, but there's always a flip side to these things, right? The source points out that this could actually squeeze Nepali businesses that are trying to compete, in that electronics market. Imagine you're a small electronics company in Nepal, and suddenly you're up against this flood of cheaper goods coming in from India.
Yeah, that's got to be tough. So it's like this potential short-term win for consumers, but maybe a tougher landscape for those local businesses that are trying to, get a foothold and grow.
Exactly. It's a trade-off, and it's not just electronics either. The source also mentions that India has actually increased tariffs on some other goods, like certain telecom equipment and some plastic products.
So like while people might be happy about those cheaper phones, they could end up paying more for other things.
It's a balancing act, and there's another number in the source that I have to mention because it really stopped me in my tracks.
Oh yeah, what's that?
Nepal's trade deficit with India is apparently a mind-blowing 893 billion rupees.
Oh wow, that is a lot of rupees.
It's a staggering number, and it really highlights just how dependent Nepal is on its larger neighbor. And it's not just about consumer goods. This imbalance can have an impact on everything from investment flows to currency stability.
Okay, so we've got India looking inward. We've got this potential for, cheaper goods flowing into Nepal, but also maybe higher prices on some other things. And then this massive trade deficit looming in the background. Where do we even begin to untangle all of this?
Well, the source makes a really important point. It argues that Nepal can't afford to just sit back and wait and see what happens. They need to be proactive.
So what does that look like?
Instead of just reacting to India's moves, they need to be analyzing these changes in detail and coming up with their own strategic response.
So like if you were advising the Nepali government right now, what would be at the top of your list? What are the key steps they should be taking?
The source lays out some pretty concrete strategies. The first thing they need to do is gather more information they need to dive deep into the data and really study how different sectors of the Nepali economy could be affected by these budget changes.
So basically figure out where the pressure points are going to be, but also, maybe where there might be some opportunities hidden in all of this.
Exactly. And once they have that clear picture, then they need to start getting strategic.
Oh, how so?
Well, they could think about implementing targeted policies to support Nepali businesses that are likely to face tougher competition from India.
Like tax breaks or something.
Yeah,
Wow.
exactly. Or easier access to credit, or maybe even helping them find new markets for their products.
So it's not just about playing defense. It's about finding ways to go on the offensive.
Right. And the source also highlights the importance of trying to boost domestic production within Nepal. The less reliant they are on imports, the less vulnerable they'll be to these kinds of shifts in India's economic policy.
So it's about building more self-reliance, which I imagine is a long-term game.
It is. It's a marathon, not a sprint, but it's about building resilience for the future.
All right, so we're talking about a multi-pronged approach. Understand the specifics, support local businesses, and work towards greater self-reliance. That sounds like a tall order, but it feels like getting this right could be crucial for Nepal's economic future.
It absolutely could. And this is where the connection between the Nepali rupee and the Indian rupee comes in, because the Nepali rupee is pegged to the Indian rupee. Whatever happens in India's economy directly affects Nepal.
Ah, that fixed exchange rate. It's been a topic of debate for years.
Yeah.
Some people see it as a source of stability, others see it as a limitation. What's your take?
Well, the source brings up a really interesting point. It mentions that even the IMF, which has historically been supportive of the fixed exchange rate, is starting to hint that it might be time for Nepal to reconsider.
Wait, even the IMF is questioning, and that's a pretty big deal. What's driving that shift in thinking?
It's subtle, but you have to remember India's budget is all about boosting their domestic production if their economy really takes off. It could put a lot of pressure on that fixed exchange rate and potentially create imbalances that might actually be harmful to Nepal.
So even though that fixed rate has provided a certain level of stability, there are concerns that it could become a liability if India's growth starts to outpace Nepal's.
That's the crux of it, and the source doesn't pretend to have all the answers. It's more about raising the question and encouraging people to think critically about the potential risks and rewards of different approaches.
Like a crossroads stick with what, are consider a bolder move.
Exactly, and that actually brings us to another potential turning point that's kind of tucked away in this source material, the question of cryptocurrency.
Cryptocurrency. Oh, color me. Intrigued. What's the connection there between cryptocurrency and this whole India-Nepal economic dynamic?
Well, the source mentions that India is starting to think about embracing cryptocurrency more formally, creating regulations and maybe even incorporating it into their financial system. And this is where things get really interesting, because if India goes down that road, starts regulating and bringing crypto into the fold, it could put pressure on Nepal to do the same, even if they're not really ready for it.
Yeah, it's like they might end up having to adapt to this whole crypto world, whether they want to or not. But let's play devil's advocate for a second. Imagine Nepal just decides to say, hey, we're breaking away from this fixed exchange rate. What do you think the potential upsides and downsides would be for like everyday people?
Well, on the one hand, more control over their own monetary policy could give Nepal a lot more flexibility. They wouldn't be so tied to what's happening in India. But on the other hand, you could see a lot more volatility. Those exchange rates could start fluctuating pretty dramatically.
I bet that would make things pretty unpredictable for businesses that rely on imports and exports.
Yeah, exactly. Imagine you're a Nepali business trying to import raw materials or export finished goods, and the exchange rate is constantly changing. That would make planning and budgeting a real nightmare.
Makes my head spin just thinking about it.
Yeah, and think about remittances too, the money that Nepali workers abroad send back home.
Right, a lot of families rely on that.
If the exchange rate is fluctuating, those remittances could be worth a lot more or a lot less, depending on the day.
So it's like more potential upside for Nepal's economy as a whole, but potentially more instability and uncertainty for individuals and businesses.
That's the trade-off. And the source material doesn't try to oversimplify it. It just lays out the complexities and encourages policymakers to really think it through.
It's a good reminder that economics isn't just some theoretical game. It's about people's lives. Speaking of which, let's circle back to something we touched on earlier, that potential impact of all these agricultural investments in India on Nepali farmers.
Right. Well, one of the things the budget does is pump a lot of money into efforts to increase agricultural productivity in India.
Which could mean Indian farmers can produce more stuff at lower prices.
Exactly. And if that happens, it could make it harder for Nepali farmers to compete, especially if they're trying to export their products to India.
That's a real concern, especially since so much of Nepal's agricultural sector is tied to that trade relationship with India. What are some ways they could adapt to that changing landscape?
Yeah. Well, the source mentions a few things. One idea is to focus on niche products. Maybe there are certain crops or agricultural goods that Nepal has a natural advantage in, things that are unique to the region or that they can produce at a higher quality.
So instead of trying to compete on volume, go for quality and specialization.
Exactly. Find those areas where Nepal can really stand out. Another strategy is to invest in technology and infrastructure.
Help their farmers become more efficient.
Right. If they can reduce their production costs, they'll be in a better position to compete.
Modernizing the agricultural sector, that's a long-term play, but it seems essential.
It is. And the source also talks about the need to explore new markets. If India becomes less of an option for exporting certain goods, maybe Nepal needs to start looking for other countries that are interested in buying their products.
So diversify those export markets.
Yeah.
Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. Spread the risk and reduce their dependence on any single country.
It sounds like Nepal's agricultural sector is at a real turning point.
It is. And it's not just agriculture. The source material also raises some red flags about the potential impact of India's Make in India initiative on Nepal's manufacturing sector.
Right. India is really trying to ramp up their domestic manufacturing. What kind of ripple effects could that have over in Nepal?
Well, if they're successful, it could mean less demand for goods that are made in Nepal, and that could be a problem for Nepali businesses that rely on that export market.
So diversification comes up again, finding new markets for those manufactured goods.
That's one option. But the source also suggests that Nepal could try to flip the script a little bit.
How so?
Instead of just exporting finished goods to India, maybe they could try to attract manufacturing investment to Nepal itself.
Oh, interesting. So bring those manufacturing operations to Nepal.
Exactly. And they actually have a few things working in their favor. They have a relatively low cost of labor, and they're geographically right next to India, which is a huge market.
Yeah, they could try to position themselves as this like prime location for companies that are looking to set up shop.
Exactly. And that could bring in foreign investment, create jobs within Nepal. It's a bold move, but it has the potential to be a real game changer.
We've covered a lot of ground here. Trade, currency, agriculture, manufacturing. It's amazing how one country's budget can touch on so many different aspects of another country's economy. Are there any other big themes that jump out at you from the source material?
There's one that I think ties all of this together, the importance of fiscal responsibility. The source highlights how the Indian government is really emphasizing careful spending, keeping their debt under control and trying to create a more sustainable economic foundation.
It's like they're trying to build a house on solid ground.
Exactly. And I think that's a really valuable lesson for Nepal to take to heart as well.
So spend wisely, avoid taking on unnecessary debt, and invest in areas that will lead to long-term sustainable growth.
That's the idea. And it's not just about government spending either. Individual businesses and even households can benefit from adopting a similar approach.
Living within your means, being mindful of where your money is going.
Exactly. It's about making sure your financial house is in order, so to speak. But I have to admit, my mind keeps going back to this whole cryptocurrency thing. It still feels like such a wild card. It could really shake things up. It's a fascinating twist, and even though the source material only mentions it briefly, it does seem to suggest that it's something Nepal needs to be taking seriously.
What makes it such a big deal in this context?
Well, you have to remember, India is starting to move towards embracing cryptocurrency, creating regulations, and potentially even incorporating it into their financial system.
And since the two economies are so intertwined.
Exactly. Nepal might find itself having to adapt to this changing landscape even if they're not quite ready for it.
It's like the crypto wave is coming, whether they're ready to surf it or not.
That's a great way to put it. And then there's the bigger question of how cryptocurrency could impact the Nepali economy as a whole. Could it create new opportunities for investment and entrepreneurship? Could it help promote financial inclusion? Could it also introduce new risks that need to be carefully managed?
So many questions, so much potential, so much uncertainty.
It's a brave new world out there, and it's moving fast.
Well, it sounds like we've really dug deep into this topic today. Is there anything else you want to highlight before we start to wrap things up?
I think the key takeaway from all of this is that even though this is India's budget, the decisions they make have real consequences for Nepal. And that's true of any major global economic shift. It's not just about what's happening in your own backyard. You have to be aware of the bigger picture and how those global forces could be impacting your life.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the big picture, how this budget could affect Nepal's economy overall. But I'm kind of curious about some of the nitty-gritty details, the actual numbers that are in this Indian budget. The source material mentions a bunch of different figures. Are there any that really jumped out at you as being particularly relevant to Nepal?
Yeah, definitely a couple come to mind right away. For example, the source talks about how India is projecting their fiscal deficit to be 4.4% of GDP.
Okay, but I'm not an economist. What does that actually mean? How do we interpret that number?
Well, basically, it tells us how much the Indian government is planning to spend beyond what they're taking in through revenue.
So they're going to be in the red?
In a way, yeah. But it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's more about finding a balance. They're trying to be fiscally responsible, but they're also willing to spend money to try to stimulate economic growth. And one of the things the source points out is that a big chunk of that spending is going towards what's called capital expenditure, which is basically investments in long-term assets like infrastructure. And that's A pretty hefty sum. We're talking 11.21 lakh crore rupees, which is like 3.1% of their GDP.
Wow. Okay, those are some big numbers, but where exactly is all that money going?
Well, a big chunk of it is earmarked for infrastructure development, things like roads, bridges, energy projects, that sort of thing.
So Nepali companies that are involved in those sectors might want to pay attention.
Exactly. There could be some opportunities there for Nepali businesses to get involved in some of these big projects. And it's not just physical infrastructure. The budget also talks about investments in digital infrastructure, things like expanding broadband internet access.
So they're laying the groundwork for a more digitally connected economy. And what about social programs? Any big changes there?
Yeah, actually, the source mentions that there's a pretty significant increase in funding for things like healthcare and education, which suggests that India is really recognizing the importance of investing in their people.
Yeah, it's like they're saying, hey, if we want our economy to grow in the long term, we need to make sure our people are healthy and educated.
Exactly. And I think that's a really important takeaway for Nepal as well. We talked earlier about the need for Nepal to become more competitive globally,
Yeah,
and a big part of that is investing in their own people.
right. Making sure they have the skills and the knowledge to thrive in the 21st century.
Exactly. It's about building human capital and this focus on human capital. It goes hand in hand with the emphasis on innovation and technology that you see throughout the Indian budget. They're setting up these things called adult tinkering labs in schools all across India.
What are those?
They're basically like these maker spaces where kids can go and experiment and get hands-on with technology and learn how to solve problems.
So they're trying to encourage creativity and that kind of entrepreneurial spirit.
Exactly. They want to cultivate a whole culture of innovation. And I think that's something Nepal could really learn from. In today's world, it's not enough to just follow the old ways of doing things. You have to be adaptable, you have to be creative, and you have to be constantly looking for new solutions.
It's about having that growth mindset, embracing change and seeing challenges as opportunities.
I love that. I think that's a great way to put it. And it's not just about coming up with the next big tech invention. Innovation can happen in any field, agriculture, manufacturing, tourism. It's about finding new and better ways to do things.
It's a mindset shift, right? It's about being open to new possibilities
There.
and not being afraid to try new things.
Exactly. And I think that's a really powerful message. And it's something that Nepal can definitely take inspiration from.
Wow. Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground today. It's been a fascinating conversation about the Indian budget and all the different ways it could potentially impact Nepal. But I think the thing that really stands out to me is just how interconnected these two economies really are. It's not just about trade or investment. It's about this complex web of relationships and influences that goes so much deeper.
I completely agree. And I think it's a reminder that we can't just focus on what's happening within our own borders. We have to be aware of the bigger picture and how those global trends are shaping the world around us.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we're all part of this global ecosystem and that what happens in one part of the world can have ripple effects that reach far and wide.
And I think that's a really important message for our listeners to take away from this deep dive. It's not just about understanding India's budget. It's about understanding the complex forces that are shaping our world and how we can all navigate those forces in a way that benefits ourselves, our communities, and our countries.
Absolutely well said. So there you have it, folks, the Indian budget. It's not just their business. It's a chance for all of us to think about those global economic connections and how they might be impacting our own lives, whether we realize it or not. And hey, keep an eye on that cryptocurrency space. Things are moving fast, and it's anyone's guess where it'll all land. Until next time, happy diving.